Hi folks, so today we're going to discuss the question, is Buddhism atheistic? So I'm Doug Smith, I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to promote a wiser, kinder, and less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll have discussions around topics such as this one, roughly speaking once a week, usually on Mondays. Topics that should help clarify the ways that we can bring wisdom and friendliness and reduce stress in the world. So today we're discussing the question, is Buddhism atheistic? And to what extent is it atheistic? And this is a long question that people have grappled with over the years, and it's a complicated question, more complicated than it might originally seem. But I'm going to try to give you a general overview. So in a previous lecture, which I will link to up above somewhere on the screen here, I discussed the Kevaddha Sutta, which is a very, very famous sutta where the Buddha describes a kind of situation that involves Brahma, that is the chief of the gods for the Brahmanic religion. In this sutta, he basically creates a kind of a satire where Brahma comes across as an ignorant blowhard, basically. So Brahma talks in very high terms about himself, but when push comes to shove, it's clear Brahma really doesn't know nearly as much as you might think he does. So that's one way that the Buddha approaches the notion of gods having greater knowledge than humans do. In a different sutta, the Tevijja Sutta, the Buddha is approached by a couple of Brahmins who recommend a path to salvation that involves unity with this Brahma, this god Brahma. And the Buddha questions them. He basically criticizes them because he asks them if they have ever met this Brahma, if they know about anything about him personally. And they say they haven't met him, they don't know anything about him personally. And then he asks if their teachers have, and they say no. And then he asks if their teachers have, and so on, back many, many generations. And the answer is no. None of them have met this Brahma personally or know anything about him personally. And so part of the question is how they can recommend union with this being that they've never met. And the Buddha gives a number of parables. He says this is like the blind leading the blind. He also says that this is like searching for a woman for marriage just based on the description that you want the most beautiful woman in the country. You're going to have a hard time finding such a person. Or he describes a case of somebody wanting to build a staircase at a crossroads up to a house without knowing what direction the house is to be built in, how tall it is, and so on and so forth. So basically in all these situations, what he's saying is, if you're trying to direct a path towards something, you better know that thing. And if you don't know where you're going, then you'll look like a fool, basically, because you're not going to get there. Or you're going to construct something that's going to be useless to your eventual purpose. They discuss further, what are the qualities of this god Brahma? Because obviously the Brahmins do know supposed qualities of this god. The god is without a spouse, the god is without possessions, the god is without ill will, without hatred, so on. But the Buddha notes the followers of this god Brahma, the priests and so on, are themselves beings with spouses, they're married, they're beings who have possessions, they have houses, they've got wealth, they're beings who display hatred and ill will towards others. And so once again the question is, how do these people expect to attain union with this being, this Brahman, if they're so different? If they're so different from Brahma to begin with? How do they even know about him very well? And in a kind of substitute, the Buddha says, instead of seeking union with Brahma by searching for something you really don't know about, and by beginning from a place that is so different from Brahma, why don't you try to make yourself more like this ideal of yours by practicing what is called in the tradition the Brahmavihara meditations, or the meditations on loving kindness, on compassion, on sympathetic joy, and on equanimity. And by practicing these kinds of meditations on a regular basis, you'll get yourself to a place that is equivalent to union with Brahma, because you will be making yourself more, as it were, in Brahma's image. You'll be making yourself less prone to anger, less prone to ill will. You'll be making yourself less interested in possessions and so on. So here the Buddha substitutes a very down-to-earth kind of this life practice for the more speculative kind of union with a supernatural being. In a different sutta in the Aṅguttara Nikāya, the Buddha talks about the notion of a creator God as being very problematic, as leading to a kind of fatalistic notion. Because if God created the world and is responsible at all times for sustaining the world, then God is responsible for our actions, both good and bad. God is responsible for murders, God is responsible for theft and for lying and so on. And God is responsible for our wrong beliefs, our ignorance, and so on. And this leads, in the Buddha's estimation, to a kind of a philosophy of non-action or non-doing, because it seems like there's nothing we can do. If God's responsible for all, then God's responsible for all that's both bad and good. In the Western tradition, this is known as the argument from evil. It's the argument that such a God as this can't exist because God is supposed to be all good, as well as all-powerful and all-knowing. But for the Buddha sort of describes this kind of view as being unhelpful, because it leads us to a feeling of uselessness, of fatalism. And so in that sense, the Buddha believes that the notion of this kind of creator God, this all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God, is just not useful to our daily practice. Nevertheless, one of the Buddha's most common descriptions in the texts is as a teacher of gods and humans. And why is that? That's because very, very often in the texts, the Buddha is described as teaching gods. That the Buddha will have gods as his pupils, as almost as much, not quite, not as much, but very often. So it's almost as much as the people, as much as his own monastic followers. So what are we to make of this kind of apparent contradiction, where on the one hand he's criticizing the notion of gods, but on the other hand he's apparently teaching gods, and so these gods must exist in his world as he sees it? And the answer, I think, is quite simple, that the Buddha was an atheist about an everlasting or all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good kind of God. He was an atheist about a God that was perfect, that was unchanging, the kind of God, frankly, of Western theology. Indeed, belief in this kind of a God is one of the wrong views listed in the Brahmajala Sutta, which is a very famous sutta at the beginning of the Nikāya that lists a bunch of wrong views. But the Buddha did not disbelieve in supernatural beings generally. Indeed, belief in supernatural beings is pretty common. Basically, it's universal in a pre-modern world. They believe that there were these kinds of supernatural beings around, but in the Buddha's picture, they were not all-powerful, not all-knowing, and not all-good. And neither were they eternally existing or everlasting. They lived and died. They were born, they lived for a time, and then they died. And so they were basically like superhumans rather than gods. Very powerful beings, but beings that were relevantly like humans in all the important respects. And in the same way that they're beings that were like humans in all relevant respects, they were also not important to Buddhist practice or to the achievement of the final goal in Buddhism of awakening. The existence of these beings is just irrelevant, really. They could exist or not exist as far as the Buddha Dharma is concerned. And the aspect of practice within should we say, religious or philosophical context in early Buddhism, these beings exist, but they're not seen as relevant. Now, in later Buddhism, we get some more sophisticated kinds of atheistic arguments. For example, the great Buddhist scholar and philosopher Vasubandhu gave a couple of arguments, one about asking how it is that the multiplicity of the world could be understood as stemming from the unity of God, and another argument wondering about why a perfect being such as God would need to create anything at all. But these kinds of sophisticated theological arguments we don't find in the earliest Nikāya texts, probably because the Buddha wasn't really interested in those kinds of very sophisticated arguments. What he was interested in was more down-to-earth kinds of issues about whether it was really useful to you to think that God was responsible for everything around you. Also in later Buddhism, particularly in elements of the Mahayana form of Buddhism, we get what's called Buddha nature, a belief in Buddha nature. And this is something that begins to approach a kind of theology where there's the idea that although the Buddha himself has passed away, nevertheless there is a kind of Buddha nature, dharmic nature of the Buddha that underlies all of reality, and that in some sense is responsible for certain aspects of reality, and that can be petitioned or prayed to in a sense, asked to do things. And so in later Buddhism, there grows up a kind of devotional Buddhism, a religious Buddhism, oriented around this kind of Buddha nature. Now the subject of Buddha nature is very complicated, and certainly much too complicated for me to get into here, but let's just say that there are aspects of it that begin to resemble something like a god in a Western sense. Maybe a deist god, a god that is perhaps non-personal, but is anyway some kind of a principle behind all things that is in some sense responsible for them and that can be petitioned. But in early Buddhism, we really don't find that. What we find, as I say, instead is a mix of ridiculing certain ideas of God, of denying that the belief in God is useful to our practice and daily life, along with a kind of belief in supernatural beings, which we nowadays can discard, and which indeed in the early context was really not relevant to any real aspect of their practice. So if you're interested in helping to create a wiser, a kinder, and a less stressed out world, please do consider subscribing to this channel. I'm really glad to have you here if it's your first time. We try to give talks like these once a week or so, on Mondays usually. If you're coming back for further discussion, then I'm really, really glad to see you back. And please do put any comments or questions in the sections down below. Always really glad to hear those. And again, thanks so much for coming. I'm really glad you're here.